creepy and geeky. Welcome to the double feature podcast of horror and more. I'm your host, Robert, and today is part 3 in our 4-part look at the Halloween franchise. Kat Voleur returns to the show to talk all about Halloween H20 and Halloween Resurrection. Kat is the co-host of Slasher Radio and a writer whose debut book, Revenge Arc, is available for pre-order now and will be released in August. Welcome back to the show, Kat.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about Halloween.
Yeah. Well, in addition to that, we should talk about your new book. We haven't had a chance to talk about that yet. So you got your debut book coming out, and
Thank you.
that's awesome. I'm excited to check it out. I did sign up to get an ARC for it. They're supposed to be sending me it. I gave them my address, so we'll see what happens. So I'm definitely ready to check it out. Why don't you tell everybody what the book is about?
The book is actually about a movie critic and comic writer who is being harassed online by a fan. It's all epistolary. It's all like found file horror. So the audience is left to draw their own conclusions. You just get to see the files.
Oh, cool. That's interesting. I like that. Very cool. Yeah, I'm excited to check it out, and it sounds kind of right in my alleyway. So, especially comic book stuff and everything. So,
I hope you like it.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So, let's jump into what was your first horror movie? You've been on the show a couple of times before, but we haven't presented this question to you. So, what was your first horror movie, if you can remember?
So I was just talking about this earlier this week because I did a review for the remake of my first horror movie, which was Cube.
Okay.
I talked about it a little bit because like there were always black and white like horror movies on in the house. Like I'm sure I'm sure my first ever horror movie was like House on Haunted Hill or like House of Wax or something. But like I was just so used to having those on that it didn't really register to me that they were supposed to be scary, you know?
Right.
Whereas like Cube, I have the distinct memory of being like, oh, I shouldn't be watching this. This is an adult movie for adults. And I did not leave.
Yeah.
I kept watching it. And yeah.
That's funny. I've never seen Cube, so I'm not real familiar with it, but I know there's a new Japanese remake of it that just came out on what is it, Screambox?
Screambox, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I will definitely have to look into that. I've never seen it, so I don't even know what it's about. So.
It's about a cube. It's very
I assumed as much, just like maybe some kind of terrifying Rubik's cube or something.
That's startlingly accurate.
All right. Well, that seems more interesting than I was thinking in the first place. So that works well for me. So, all right. Okay. So, well, let's jump right into Halloween H20. This movie came out in 1998. It's part of the post-Scream boom of horror movies. So this one's got a 90s, like a late 90s era cast, but it's also the return of Jamie Lee Curtis to the role of Laurie Strode for the first time since Halloween 2, and it's an interesting movie. I like it. It's definitely the Halloween movies were kind of a blind spot for me. I had seen like the first 3 when I was a kid, but I hadn't seen any of the other ones until more recently. And so I didn't grow up with them. I was more of a Jason and Freddy kind of guy until Scream came along. And So I knew I had actually seen H2O right around the time it came out, probably on video after it came out. But it's it definitely has that post Scream feeling. It's funny too because I didn't realize it until today when I was looking up the trivia that Kevin Williamson had a heavy hand in kind of rewriting it and stuff like kind of I guess after the original writer wrote it, but he kind of ghost wrote it. He couldn't get credit for it, but they credited him as an executive or no, a co-executive producer on the movie. So he definitely had a big influence on it. So which I thought was interesting.
And you can tell, like,
Oh yeah,
that's I don't want to know I don't want to call this a complaint because I really like the Scream movies, but one like differentiation between H2O and I think the rest of the Halloween series is that this one does feel more like watching a Scream movie than watching a Halloween
right.
movie. Like,
Yeah,
it's a little bit uncanny. I think I I'm pretty sure I had seen Scream before I saw Halloween. So I it wasn't something that I noticed my first watch through either. Um, but it is like on the rewatch, having paid closer attention to all of the Halloween movies and all of the Scream
right.
movies than I did as a kid, it's a little bit hard to miss the similarities. There's I getting a little bit ahead of myself probably, but there's the one scene in particular with the gate where
Okay.
it feels more like you're watching Ghostface in a Michael mask than like there's just a lot
Yeah,
of fumbling and like
yeah,
you know
yeah.
I don't want to call it silliness, but he loses some of his like calm in this one.
Right. Yeah. No, and it was interesting too because this has this young cast in it, but really it's about Lori. And so you don't really like to me anyway. I didn't really get a big feel for the characters, the young characters, not even her son. I mean, just that he was a good son trying to take care of his mom and trying to help her out, but wanted to grow up and and move on, and trying to help her move on because he obviously knew about Michael and everything and her past and all that. But so it was a little strange. You're introduced to all these young characters, but they die so quickly. And don't get me wrong, like a lot of slasher movies are like that in general too. You don't get a real feel for a lot of characters. You just get the archetypes. So
It was a little bit different though in Halloween up
yeah,
until H2O. Well, okay. There are exceptions. You guys have been talking about this franchise, so I'm sure you know. But like with this one in particular, it does feel like it falls more into that like Friday the 13th area where you do kind of need the extra people that are being used kind of as like slasher fodder. And that
right,
was something that like Halloween had always been a little bit because it was like a late 70s early 80s slasher franchise, and all of them were a little bit guilty of having that. But Halloween for the most part, like the characters had names that I'm not going to say I remember the names of all the characters in the original Halloween film, but like I could keep track of who was who very easily while I was watching. They
right,
had kind of it was very sophisticated in the way that it was presented, and then it had a focus on one character, which in the
yes,
first one was Lori, and then later on we had Jamie and stuff. And this one was very interesting in that Lori is connected to the main crew, but the slashing wasn't happening like in her immediate vicinity this time.
right.
And it was a strange framing. Um, but
It
I,
was
I do think it made
interesting.
it
Yeah,
stand out a little bit.
yeah. No, it definitely stands out. Like, I mean, there are these definite up to this point. This is the third distinct um like section because in the in the first two movies they're combined with each other. Taken out of you know just as a movie and a sequel. You just take them together; they work well. Number three sets itself off by itself. Four, five, and six are part of that, a Jamie Lloyd Cult of Thorn trilogy. And this one and the next one, Resurrection, are part of this, like, continuation. We're going to wipe away four, five, and six, and just follow up one and two. Although they barely reference two. The only real
Yeah.
reference to number two that we get is just that Michael is her brother.
Right.
They kind of gloss over all the other stuff about him being burned in the hospital or anything else like that. So a lot of that other stuff is kind of wiped away, which I found interesting. But it's but yeah, like everybody just kind of is in his way, and everybody who's in his way, like, and not even like particularly in his way, they just happen to be around, which, to be fair, I mean, that's kind of how it is in most of the Halloween movies. But yeah, he's got that singular focus that he's just always trying to go after Laurie or some other member of his family. So in the case of Jamie, so it's it's a little funky, getting from A to B. But
It is Halloween is a weird franchise to watch chronologically because it does
yes,
uh try that. But I give it some I feel like I pick on H20 sometimes, but I do actually really like that they had the courage to, because one of my favorite Halloween movies is 2018, and a
mm-hmm.
lot of those ideas pretty much were taken out of H20.
Yeah,
Like I like that they took it in a more serious note, whereas this one felt more silly to me. But I have to really respect H20 for being ahead of its time, where it was
yeah,
just like, we have this killer, they want us to make more movies. We really screwed up the timeline, like it's all over the place,
yeah,
and we have Curse, and we're just going to reset from when it worked. And it's kind of, it makes it weird to watch back as a series retroactively, but I'm glad that they did it.
right. Well,
And
and what's
I like the
interesting,
precedent.
what?
And I like that they set that precedent too. Like,
Yeah, no, I do like that they, like, they were trying to explore, the trauma that she had endured. And
yeah,
then, 20 years later, she was still seeing him, still having, visions of him, still waking up, having nightmares and stuff, which, anybody would from that kind of ordeal. And, where they took it again. And I think in 2018, they did a even more serious take. I think because at that point, it's now another 20 years later. And I think we as an audience and we as a society understand trauma even better.
yeah,
So it's a lot easier for us to digest and understand where she's coming from a lot more than maybe it would have been in H20, where most people were just looking for a slasher, just the straight up slasher, especially in the wake of Scream and trying to reboot the Halloween franchise and everything. So um but but I did find it funny too, because they do wipe away four, five, and six, but apparently there was a plan to fold them in. Uh there was going to be mention of Jamie Lloyd and everything, and it was supposed to be a moment where so one of the students was doing a report on Michael Myers or whatever, and about Jamie Lloyd and everything. And then it was supposed to like be so upsetting that Laurie was supposed to like run off to the bathroom and throw up and everything like that, because it gave her a panic attack or whatever over it. And so I find that interesting that they were going to include it, but then they wiped it away, except for they kept one little thing in, which was the whole car accident. Because in four, five, and six, we're told that Jamie Lloyd's parents died in a car accident.
yeah,
And in this one, in H20, the car accident was a cover up so that Laurie could go on and find a new identity to live under. So just thought that was a
yeah. That's
interesting piece where they almost connected it, but then
I
decided to back away from it, which I get. Don't get me wrong. I get why they did it, just to kind of like, okay, let's, get rid of all this extra stuff that we don't really need to tell this particular story.
Yeah, which I also understand that, but like even when you were describing that, I got a little bit lost trying to like I think that would have been a really cool thing to do. Like it would have been a neat angle.
Yeah.
Um I'm kind of sad that it didn't happen. Like I understand, you know.
Yeah.
Um
No, that's the always the frustrating thing for me too, is that like as much as I want to um like whenever I read that stuff, it's always it's like wow, the like what could have been like, they could have tied it together fairly easily without having to go deep in depth into 4, 5, and 6 and just have it as a reference, have it something of her past, you know, and
yeah.
it's just because Jamie would have been older than her son John. So it could have been something about like, she had to give up the one child, and there could have been an even deeper, more complex, traumatic experience for her, that would have added a lot more depth to Lori as a character as well, and just how much Michael has affected her life. So it would have been an interesting take. Definitely, probably would have been more than one movie to kind of parse out for all
It
of
would
that.
have been, and it's something that I do think is really interesting about movies in this like particular era is that and it's not even a hypothetical because we do have the latest Halloween trilogy, but it's like that's the kind of stuff that we would focus on in revisiting a franchise like this today.
Right.
Um, and it's a complaint that I think everyone has had with some movie or another that films are getting like the runtimes in horror movies are getting very indulgent to the directors. Sometimes like, and everyone has their limit on that, but it's like it's wild how close all of these like establishing slashers were to like that 90-minute mark, where it's
Yeah.
like even things like this that could have hinted that wouldn't have taken that much extra time. It's like, no, we've
No.
really gotta get as much slashing in as possible.
What and the funny thing is, number one, this is actually H2 is actually the shortest of all of the movies.
Oh, is
Um,
it
eh,
really?
yeah. And then on top of that, that's what I read anyway. I didn't like fact check it, but I'm pretty sure it is. But then on top of that, it also like I was watching it and I checked the time and it was just before an hour. It was like 51 minutes. And there had been, a couple of kills and stuff like that, but there was a lot of exposition. And so that like getting to that point, like, the last half hours, or so is roughly when things, basically right around the 51-minute mark, last 40 minutes or so are kind of the, you know, like the meat of the movie. You know, the major excitement things going on. But it definitely there could have been some more story put in there somewhere.
And that is it's one of my problems with H2O. It is kind of one of the reasons why I do pick on it sometimes. Because I do feel like in Halloween, in like the first two, and then this one's supposed to be going back to that, but I feel like those films are paced excellently. Like it's so good, it's so tight and focused, and with any slasher genre, like they're going to get longer and maybe a little bit clumsier in
Right.
how they approach things. H2O, it almost feels like two movies that have been kind of mashed together because the
Yeah.
pacing, it's like they're trying to set up a full slasher movie about these kids, even though we're not going to be spending that much time with these kids. So the beginning feels very like meandering almost,
Right. Well, and
Um,
I think that has a lot to do with the Kevin Williamson of it all.
yeah.
That they brought him in to tighten up that last part. And I think that's why the last part is fairly okay and everything kind of meanders up until that point. Um, because I know that's partially why he didn't get credit was that he had to, like, according to WGA rules, is that you have to write like 35% of the movie.
Oh,
And so he didn't have quite that much to do with it. So I mean, but I believe he was either on set or accessible to them during filming to uh, rewrite stuff on the fly or whatever. And apparently Jamie Lee Curtis herself had a lot of, her and the director Steve Miner uh had a lot of, they worked on everything kind of together, like all three of them kind of worked on it all together to make it better um than what it, I guess, what it would have been. And again, I don't think it's a terrible movie at all. I think it's
No.
one of the better entries in the series, but it's definitely, it definitely suffers a little bit in there. So
It does. It has its flaws. And that being said, but I agree. I don't think that it is a terrible movie. I think that I Jamie Lee Curtis does an amazing job, and I think it
yeah,
was a good extension of Laurie's story, you know.
yeah,
I wish that they had had more time for that story and less time setting up uh, the plot feels very convoluted, like there are
yeah,
a lot of
yeah,
extra steps and yeah, which again for like an introductory, yeah, if this were the first in its own franchise, I would be a lot more forgiving of it, because you've got to spend
right,
time with that like first group of kids and you've got to uh, make it very plausible why they're going to do whatever they're doing. But in this one, it would have been enough of a pass to be like, okay, field trip time, and then just like let it go from there. But
yeah. No, I
yeah,
agree. I think that, if this had been, if they had followed this up with another movie, like, and we'll get into Resurrection here in a moment, but, Resurrection doesn't really follow up on anything that's set up in any of this. And so,
no.
and partially that's because realistically, Jamie Lee Curtis didn't want to do much with this movie, with Resurrection. And
Yeah.
they just didn't follow up on anybody else, like her son or anything. So it's just, it's they all this potential that they had there, and then it was just kind of like, we're gonna go in a different direction, and we're gonna make the most early 2000s horror movie that we could. uh and it's just, yeah. So it's just, that is disappointing that it could have potentially been a very, maybe in a similar vein, but not quite what we got with David Gordon Green's trilogy. We get more of this examination of trauma, how that affects, your children, and and so forth. It's like, that's what's frustrating about it, is you can see in H2O they had that germ of the idea that
Yeah.
David Gordon Green picked up on and fleshed out in full, and more about, like, how that affected everybody. So
And it's my favorite part of H2O is that like the idea was there. And I wish they could have followed through on it a little bit more in H2O because then and again we're gonna get into it soon, but Resurrection I think could have been stronger if they had if this one had done maybe a little bit of a better job with what it was trying to do. But it had its moments, it had the concept, and I don't want to say this for the entire franchise, but one of my favorite things about H2O is I think it had one of the strongest ends to a Halloween film. Like, I really liked the conclusion of this one.
yeah, yeah. Well, and part of that was because, so, we'll get into that, that, we are left with Laurie chopping off Michael's head,
Yeah.
and what feels like a very definitive ending. But the crux of all this is that that's what Jamie Lee Curtis signed on for. Was she wanted this to be it. She was like, I am done with this. Like, I will come back, I will do this movie, but I want to kill Michael in the end and be done. Well, unfortunately, Mustafa Akkad, which is the guy who owned and controlled it all, had a clause in his contract that you couldn't kill Michael. So that led to what ends up happening in this. So at the end of this, we see him get his head cut off, presuming that it's actually him. And which is great, as a film, you're just like, oh my God, she did it. She killed him off. It's awesome. Like, that's it. It's done. It's like this is a great capper to this, this not only this movie, but the whole franchise, blah, blah, blah. And then we get into Resurrection and it's completely undone because that's how they got away with it was they built that into it that it wasn't Michael's head that she cut off. It was somebody else who Michael had switched outfits with. And so
Yeah.
so they got to have their cake and eat it too, basically. They got to continue the franchise and you still get that moment of her killing them. So uh
Which, yeah, and we'll talk about it when
yeah,
when we get to Resurrection. That's one of my Resurrection started on a sour note for me
yeah, yeah,
because it's like because again they immediately undid it. They had like this
yeah,
emotional, very impactful, surprisingly poignant end to
yeah,
the slasher franchise, and then immediately it's like, just kidding, no.
yeah, yeah.
You can't have nice things in Halloween anymore. It's like, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's yeah, I don't know. It's but I think that it one of the funny things about this movie, I'll go backwards here for a second, is that so the young cast is full of, you know, late 90s, early 2000s people. We got Josh Hartnett, we got Michelle Williams, we got Jodie Lynn O'Keefe, who I know best from She's All That. She plays
Okay.
the kind of like bitchy like girl in that one. Um, and that was a great one with oh my god, blanking on his name now, and I hate that. Matthew Lillard and Freddie Prinze
Oh,
Jr.
right.
It's a goofy, you know, teen rom com thing. Um, so, but that's where I remember her from. Well, the boyfriend of her character, I was like, who is this guy? Like, I couldn't quite put my finger on it,
Hmm.
and I realized he plays young Alan Parrish. Like I figured it out. He plays young Alan Parrish in the first Jumanji movie.
Oh, that's so fun.
Yeah, and it's only like 3 years later because Jumanji came out in '95 and this came out in '98. So it's only 3 years later. I was like, okay, he grew up. Like, I mean, I understand, kids grow up and everything like that. But I was like, oh, he grew up and now he's the horny friend of the group, and so
Now you're never gonna
but,
watch Jumanji the same way
right,
again.
right. But yeah, no, I just it was just an odd revelation to do that, because I hadn't really seen him as far as I know, I haven't really seen him do much else beyond Jumanji. So
Yeah.
it's always
I'm not
funny.
sure I ever would have put that together.
Well, and
Not
then
sure
we
I would
get
have
Joseph
recognized.
Gordon-Levitt in the beginning as well too. I did not remember he was in this movie at all. So when he pops up, I was like, oh, okay. So
That one I did recognize, but I think only because I saw the name like pop up in the. Or I don't think I would have pieced that one together until I was on
I
IMDb.
I do think it's funny that the woman who plays Marion, the nurse from Halloween 1, and she's
Hmm.
in this one. She gets killed by Michael in this one before the opening credits. Uh, that she's also in Halloween Kills as well. So she's popped up in different iterations of this. Uh, so it's actually kind of cool that she's been able to like you bump that along each time. So
Yeah, that's
yeah.
fun.
So,
And I do like they got a little bit crazy, especially in Kills. Kills, I think, is where they started to kind of get away with more stuff like that. But they did have a
oh
lot
yeah.
of fun Easter eggs, and like that's not one I had spotted.
Yeah, yeah, it's fun to see her like be able to contain the character, especially because they get to wipe away H20 in the
Yeah,
2018 continuity, so they get to she gets to live again, um at least for a little while. I can't
for a
remember if she
tiny
dies
bit,
in Halloween Kills, but yeah, I think she does. So I think she's
statistically.
been yeah, I think she's died twice to Michael Myers. So that's a rare thing to do in this world. Um, but yeah. All right. Yeah, let's
Um,
jump into
oh,
Halloween Resurrection unless you have something else you want to say about
I one
H2O.
final thing about
Yes.
H2O. One final grievance that I need to get on record.
Do it.
The mask. I
Oh God.
I just this was the and I think it's really cool, especially like in the David Gordon Green ones, how the mask kind of evolves.
Yes.
I don't the mask in H2O, it is the worst of all the Michael Myers masks. And it
And that's
is
saying a lot because there are a lot of terrible masks in this franchise.
yeah, it's
So
saying a lot, but this is always the one that I think of where it's like there's that one shot uh of him where it's just he looks so silly and it's like, oh
yeah.
no.
Well, I think the major problem with this was that the mask was too tight and you could see his eyes. And
Yeah.
so, we don't like he's the shape for a reason. It's not supposed to be we're not supposed to see him emote with his eyes.
Yeah, you
Um
can't see the full eyes. Just
which I get was kind of the point because they wanted you to see it at the end where you get that kind of poignant scene and everything.
yeah.
And and that was part of it. But you could do something just for that end part. You didn't need to do like something before like through the whole movie to make that point that oh you could see his eyes, blah blah blah.
Yeah, like the
Um
mask could have been torn or like
yeah,
something. There were ways to get around it because and it looked like it was very reflective of the light. Like
yeah,
there are a lot of shots where he just looks kind of like a disembodied head, and you're like,
yeah,
what
yeah.
is happening? Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, these two movies especially just have some of the most terrible masks. I mean, Resurrection's got a terrible mask as well. So
It does. The one point
it's
I will give it, because I have a lot of grievances about Resurrection, but I do think the mask was slightly better. I don't like if
slightly.
you had shown me the movies out of order, I'd be like, what a terrible Michael Myers mask. But watching them back to back, it's always like, well, at least it's not the Resurrection mask.
Oh man. Yeah. So all right. So jumping into this, we already kind of talked about it a little bit about that opening
The
with
opening sequence.
yeah, the opening sequence. Lori's back, but she's been in a hospital, a mental hospital since the end of the last movie, due to the realization that she cut off somebody else's head and not Michael's. So she feels horrible about it, and she's just but it really seems like she's just protecting herself until Michael shows up. Honestly,
Yeah.
that's all it really seems to be is she's just putting walls between her and trying to protect anybody else in her life, just kind of sequestering herself away, kind of like what she does in the David Gordon Green stuff, where she just kind of, you know, walls herself away from everything. Um, that this is kind of more literal. So,
And again, I know that they couldn't do this because Jamie Lee Curtis was like ready. She had one foot out the door when
oh yeah,
Resurrection like started. So I understand, but it's like again, I don't think that's a bad concept. Like and
no,
I think Resurrection would have been a better Halloween film if they had like sought that idea out, where we've got
right,
a deeper Jamie story, we've got the survivor's guilt, we have these questions
yeah,
now about what kind of a person she's turning into um in order to survive, like there's a lot of really good stuff there. And I didn't check the runtime. It That's all done in like 10 or 15 minutes
yeah,
of the movie. Like we're just
yeah.
like, don't even worry about this. And it's like, oh God, no.
Yeah. Now, the movie that could have been if it had been a better movie and if she'd been willing to make that movie, like we could have seen that. What we get again, we keep referencing the David Gordon Green because I think both of
Yeah.
these movies kind of help inform him of where he wants to take her. That germ of these ideas in these movies, just with her, um, find fruition with his movies. And that's because that's what could have been is instead of walling her away inside this thing, we could have seen her like her kind of like you said, what does this do to her? Like, how does this, does she start preparing? Does she start, almost that kind of history that we don't really see in 2018. We just hear bits and pieces of about what she'd been doing, those last 40 years.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of what's maddening, is if they had kind of followed that into that, and that was what Halloween Resurrection had become. One, that would have been a much better movie.
Yeah.
Um, and two, it would have led into basically kind of what we get with the David Gordon Green trilogy of just kind of bridging that gap in a way. And so and then you wouldn't have to wipe any of that away. So it's frustrating to not get that, to like look back on what could have been, especially on what we got with the 2018 version. And
Yeah.
so it's just bizarre. So, we just, this is all about this first 15 minutes is all about Jamie just waiting, not Jamie, Laurie just sitting there waiting for Michael to show up, which he eventually does 3 years later. She's been in this asylum this whole time, presumably just waiting for him, because they give her meds. She spits them out, sticks them in her Raggedy Ann doll. She's got a bunch of meds in there. So, which I'm like, why don't you just flush them down the toilet when you have a chance?
What if you
But
need to
then,
drug somebody later and
yeah,
break
yeah,
out the Raggedy Ann doll? Just
yeah, drug that creepy dude who wears masks and knows all about the serial killers and stuff that obviously has issues. Um, I mean, but it's, but so yeah, he eventually just shows up. Finally, 3 years later, he just shows up and she sees him and she's like, okay, it's time to go. And she's prepared and ready. And it's like the stupidest fucking thing. Um, because in that moment, and I get it, and it is part of that thing where like that potential for something more, because she's got him strung up. And she realizes, well, wait, if what if this isn't him? What if this is
yeah.
again somebody else? I can't take that chance. And she goes to take off his mask, and that's when he grabs her and manages to stab her and kill her. Um, and it's just bizarre.
It's yeah, and it's so crazy the way that like studio negotiations can really just mess up a franchise, because as much as I don't like a lot of what they did with Resurrection on the heels of H20, it's not, I think it would have been a much more palatable movie if we had been able to look at it as like its own, it's like another silly off the rails slasher movie, and not, but this, like, it gave us a taste of the story we could have had. It wrapped up an entirely different story. It undid other stuff. And it wastes time doing all of those things before being like, anyway, so we're going to take you here to this thing that's totally unrelated. And,
Right.
oh, and like,
Uh,
and it could have, that's the thing that also kills me, is I think under different contexts, I Resurrection could have worked. It's a weird comparison to draw because I think that Season of the Witch is a lot better, but it was kind of something we had
yeah.
already seen in the Halloween franchise, where it's like we're going to have this one crazy fun installation where we have freedom to do something different. And Resurrection had a lot of, it was a very 2000s movie like you
Yes.
said,
Yes.
but that was kind of its own vibe, like I think it could have done a lot better in the 2000s when it came out, but it the fact that they had to include all the stuff with Laurie at the beginning
Yeah.
against everybody's better judgment
Yeah.
really shot this one in the foot immediately.
Well, I think that if this had not been a Halloween movie, that it could have potentially worked as just as another horror movie, like some other slasher, um or some kind of supernatural thing going on in the house, because it's all about this group of people going into the Michael Myers house or the Myers home and exploring it and trying to find the meaning behind his madness. And it's it's silly, like very silly, but it could have been better if it had been taken out of that Halloween context and done with somebody else. Like just create a new
Absolutely.
slasher and make it interesting with that. And it could have been like, a takeoff on Michael even without being directly him. Um, and so that could have been a more interesting way to do it. But of course, it's they had to attach Michael to it and create this to just kind of continue on the franchise. And it's not surprising that it failed and they kind of just went, okay, yeah, this franchise is done. We'll wait a few years and then they brought in the Rob Zombie stuff.
And it is so frustrating because this, when you look at it as like a streaming reality show kind of thing, this was a movie that was way ahead of its time. Like we've seen little
Yeah.
elements of this kind of, cannibalized into other projects since then. Getting in a crowd that wanted to see something like that in what did this come out in 2000? Like what
It was
year was this?
2002.
2002.
Yeah.
Like doing something like that in 2002 I think would have been a huge deal. This could have been a cult classic standalone film, and I think it would be much more fondly remembered. But this uh, it pulled in people that wanted to see Halloween movies and then gave us this, and it's like it's a whole different beast of a thing.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
especially with
Yeah.
especially with Halloween, because I I feel like I'm more lenient to other slasher franchises. Freddy and like Pinhead are both pretty high concept. Jason
Yeah.
had a really long road to get to the more high concept stuff. They were both in places where, by the end, if they wanted to go to space or be in a video game or like whatever they were doing, it was fine. It was completely acceptable. But it's like Michael Myers, at least when they started, was like these were more serious movies. They were
Yeah.
the dark end of slashers in the late 70s and through a good chunk of the 80s. And, these are
Right.
not the kind of fans that are going to want to see, you know,
Yeah. No, I mean, you've kind of hit on it too, because this franchise up until this point is arguably a more serious franchise about this evil and this madness and how it's affecting this family. And then you get this, taking number three out of it because that was meant to be something different, but and wasn't attached. Whereas this is attached to that, but goes in this like you said, this kind of goofy, weird way. Like because the humor in any of the previous um movies of this franchise wasn't it didn't feel real intentional. It wasn't people cracking jokes and trying to make the audience laugh. Whereas like this one was definitely like sight gags and jokes and one-liners and everything, just trying to make the audience laugh in addition to trying to scare them. Well, I use that scaring them lately because the movie's definitely not scary at all. But so it's like you got Busta Rhymes being silly and just everything just comes off completely tonally wrong compared to everything else that came before it.
yeah.
So
And
I
it
think that's where it derailed, big time.
it did. And again, it could have been this could have been a fun movie in so many contexts, but it was a bad Halloween film. Like it didn't do
Yeah.
anything for the franchise. It arguably made some strong points of the previous entries worse.
Yeah.
And I think I think there's a reason why this is not a well loved. It's not my least favorite, but it's
Oh,
near the
interesting.
bottom. It's like
Interesting.
it's close. Close
Oh,
race
all
to the
right.
bottom.
Well, now I need to know what is your least favorite one of the franchise.
My least favorite, and one of the reasons why I almost didn't choose to do 7 and 8, I really hate The Curse of Michael Myers. I hate it so much.
Okay, have you watched the producer's cut version?
I have not.
Okay, so the producer's cut version is actually way better and actually
I
makes
hear that it's
sense.
better.
So it may actually change your mind because I actually I had just watched the producer's cut for the first time this week, and it's really good. Well, I wouldn't say it's really good. It makes more sense. Um, and doesn't like because the theatrical version just it's chaotic and messy, and there's lots of things that just don't make sense. And
Yeah, I
this
did
one
not
actually,
understand.
yeah, this one actually has a through line. You get the whole Cult of Thorn stuff, and it makes some sense, some more sense than any of the other than the other version. So I mean, it does the producer's cut, it definitely helps
That might
a
I
lot.
you know, I
So
think I have a copy of the producer's cut. I remember we had I was on another podcast where we were talking about Halloween movies. We were just ranking them. That was the whole thing.
right,
And I remember like sitting down, I had to go all over the place to get my hands on a copy of Halloween 6. And I finally got it. It automatically played the theatrical version.
oh,
And
okay,
then
gotcha.
there was like that hesitation where it's like, should I, because I finished it and I was so mad about it. And it's like, should I watch like the full the producer's cut? And then it was like, I can't with this movie anymore. Like I was so mad coming out of Halloween 6.
Yeah, yeah, definitely give that a chance when you get the time, because I
Right.
think that it will at least hopefully
Will it bring it
be.
above Resurrection?
It does for me, for
Right.
sure. Like Resurrection's my bottom one. Number five is actually my second least favorite. So, um,
Oh
and
wow.
just because that one just seems chaotic and messy to me in a way that you know, just
It's
I don't know,
initially
it doesn't
plot.
jive with what happened in number four fully, and so it's just weird. So, but yeah,
They do have a Halloween as a franchise does have a lot of entries where like it sets up something really cool and then it can't quite stick the landing in
right,
the next installation because it's like I don't hate 5, but or I think it's fine. I think it's like passable film.
right,
But it was a huge letdown from 4 where like they set up cool stuff and then they can't really
yeah,
commit. H2O, I don't, you can't even say that it set it up, I guess. H2O was just like it had a very brilliant ending and then
yeah,
Resurrection comes in and it's like no.
just undoes it completely. Yeah, in such a crap way. Yeah,
And
yeah,
I know a
it's
lot of people feel that way about the Rob Zombie ones also, where,
yeah.
like the first one a lot of people liked and then people were watching the second one and they're like, what the hell is
I've
this?
heard a lot of people though. I've heard a lot of people over the last couple of years, like a lot of people like Halloween 2, Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. Um,
Yeah,
because it is so different, it charts its own path. And again, that one tells kind of a story of trauma. Um,
it does.
and and that's again where I think that, we get these little bits between H2O and you get Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, where you get these bits about these people surviving this and what that does to you, and where I guess we get that culmination in David Gordon Green's trilogy, um in a way that it works a lot better for audiences. And again, I think that's again because audiences themselves got a little bit more sophisticated and were ready for it
Yeah.
when it finally came around. So
There were a lot of years in horror, and I don't like. There's this whole like elevated horror idea that
yeah,
I don't really like because it's like
right,
horror has always had these elements, and I don't
yeah,
like the idea that we've gotten like necessarily better or higher brow. But there were decades in horror where you did kind of have to like a lot of it was allegorical. Like you kind of had to
right,
hide messaging and stuff behind like these big creatures and stuff. And it is kind of nice, I think, especially in the slasher genre, that we're able to confront those things more directly, like with
yeah,
the Gordon Green trilogy.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's definitely a good thing. Yeah, I don't prescribe to the elevated horror stuff either, because it's just a silly kind of when people do that, it's a dismissive thing about horror in general. They're all like, okay, well, I like these movies like Midsummer and Hereditary because they're really just kind of dramas with horror touches or whatever like that. It's like, no, they're horror. Shut up. stop trying to dismiss it and try to say, it's no different than, Friday the 13th or whatever, because it's not. It different genres in different subgenres in horror, but it doesn't make one better than the other.
No,
So
not at all.
because it's all
And
about personal taste.
it is. And I think in a weird way, even though I don't think Halloween had the best executions of these things, I like we talked about today with H20 and Resurrection, like we were already addressing, trauma and like the personal feelings behind these stuff in slasher movies 20 years ago. Like
Yeah.
it's always been a very integral part of what makes slashers scary, at least the good ones.
Yeah. Well, and I like that these Halloween movies have tried to do this where they're like, okay, well, we're going to take a look 20 years later. We're going to see where Laurie's at now.
Yeah.
And then we're going to take a look 40 years later and we're going to see how she's doing now, and kind of twist the narrative a bit so that we kind of erase everything else and see where she's at, if only this one event happened. And, it's interesting to get that perspective because you don't really get that in very many of the, franchise, slasher stuff. Friday the 13th just kind of, keeps meandering from campground to campground. Um, and then Freddy kind of charted an interesting path along the way, but
Yeah.
but we haven't gotten that look back, 20 years later, 40 years later, like what is that effect? I mean, we kind of got that with Freddy versus Jason. We kind of got a kind of look at how those events affected the parents and the teenagers that were now there and everything. So they did have that. So I'll go along with that one. But so Halloween kind of exists in this rare area that it continues to try to do something like that, while kind of ignoring bits of its continuity, which I think is weird though, because you could fit some of that in if you wanted to.
If you
um
wanted to, you could have fit more of the
yeah,
Halloween continuity in.
yeah, you don't have to
Um,
completely dismiss it.
I like that it was doing this kind of stuff ahead of the curve because I we see it a little bit more often now. Like in Scream, we
Yeah,
have those kind of like check-ins with Sydney and like the core cast, and
yeah,
I hate to bring this up as anything, but we do also, for better or definitely worse, get to see Sally Hardesty 40 years after the
yes,
fact. I wish we hadn't, but we
yeah,
did, and now I can't unsee it. And but I do think it's interesting that Halloween was sort of it again, it was on that like early curve, and I H20 in particular I think is a very it's an interesting example because it's almost like a trial run for what they were able to do later.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I think like we've said, this was like this template that they could take and go, okay, well, what worked here, what didn't work, and how can we fix that? And and make it something more relevant to today. Take out everything else that happened, and make it just this one thing. And how would that affect her and her life and everybody around her? So
And they got a lot of like good ideas there that they were able to refine from H20. I think one of my least favorite elements of the of Halloween Ends actually comes from Resurrection also, where they got all the worst stuff from Resurrection. The worst concepts were born here. They made it, and I don't think it's a bad concept in theory, but I don't think they finished polishing it in Halloween Ends either, where they made it more about the house. And
yeah,
while I think that's a very interesting story, my biggest problem with Halloween Ends is that they tackled a lot of things at more of a surface level, and that was one of the things where it was like they introduced this element where it's like and they started it in Kills, I guess, where it's like Michael just wants to go home, and they
yeah,
introduced this thing about the house. And it's something that on the rewatch today with Resurrection, I was thinking about, where it's like that does kind of like the house is very important in Resurrection. Um,
Right. Yeah.
and if in another 20 years someone wants to explain the draw between Michael Myers and the house, I would be kind of interested to see like what they could do with that in a full concept, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I
Because
don't
it
think it's
feels
a
like
bad
it's
idea, but
no, and it feels like something that's been very, very lightly touched on in that, and we've never gotten a full why, like, because that was something that, like, I wondered too, like at the end of Halloween Kills when he's just trying to get up to the house and get into that room. It was
yeah.
like, but why? Why? What was the point? And then they never tell you. You never get that kind of closure on that moment. So it's one of those things where that's a piece that I was interested in that they didn't do for Halloween Ends. So
Yeah. I also, because again they touched on it enough to remind you that it was something that they had opened up, but
right.
I don't really feel like we got answers to a
No, yeah,
satisfactory level. Still
exactly.
better than Resurrection by
Oh yeah,
miles,
by
but
miles. Yeah.
I
I
would
like
stay put
Halloween
just a
Ends.
little bit
Like
further.
I like Halloween Ends a lot. I like what it's trying to say. It's I don't want to get into it.
Yeah.
I'm not doing those for this series. I already did an episode with my daughter on the David Gordon Green trilogy. So,
Aw.
but I like what they were trying to say about you know that damage and everything that it does to everybody, and in the wake of what happened in Halloween Kills and stuff. So it's an interesting, story that they, try to do. Is it super successful? Not always, but I think, overall I liked it a lot, and because it was something different. Um
I had a really weird relationship with Halloween Ends because I went to see it in the theater. I went like on
okay.
opening day to see it, and it was like, and I came out of it, and it's like people are gonna really hate this, but I don't think it was that bad. And immediately, like people were so mad about it when it first dropped, and then on
Yeah.
the rewatch, a lot of people came around, and now so I've gone from thinking it was way better than everyone else to thinking I might not like it as much as everyone else because it's just like
So
it's
you've
like
gone
a
the
middle of
opposite
the
direction from
road.
everybody else. Everybody else has gained appreciation for it, and you're just like, yeah, I don't like this one as much as I thought I did.
I mean, like, no, I've like stayed the same. Like,
Oh,
I
okay, I got
I
you.
have
I
like that
got you.
same level, but everyone else kind of like flip flopped on me to the point where
Right.
it's like, I, huh, all right,
That is surprising. I hadn't really heard too many. The backlash was hard on it when it first came out. So
it
it
was.
was, it was because because that's what cracked me up. And don't get me wrong, the marketing was like, oh, it's the final showdown between Laurie and Michael, and everybody thought that was going
Yeah,
to be the whole movie. And I was like, you did get that in the movie. There was the final showdown. It was short,
it
and
was
you
just
didn't
very
like it.
short.
Yeah, you don't like it. I get it. But you already had that in number one. That's what, or not number one, but in 2018, that was the Laurie versus Michael, like, big beatdown movie.
Yeah,
So that's where I go back to all that. Like each one of these movies was trying to say something different. And you already got that in 2018. That's why they were like, we don't want to do this again. We already did this. Let's do something different.
I do like
Um,
that they did something different. Like they
yeah.
took they took a lot of big swings with Halloween
Oh yeah.
Ends, and Um, my one wish is that they no, I have a lot of wishes, but I do wish that they had explained the house. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I do like what's that draw? What's that pull? Like, especially because you take Lori out of that, like that family concept. You take it, you split that up so that they're not brother and sister anymore. So that's not his motivation anymore. His motivation isn't to get to Lori, it's to get to his home. So what was the reason for him to get to his home? Was it just because that was his home when he was a kid and that's what he remembers? And there's no more complex thought than that? Or you know was it something different that they didn't explain that I was hoping for a better explanation or at least some explanation because
hints,
it's never
like,
never actually explained. So
yeah, something to kind of lead us to a conclusion there would have been really
yeah,
nice. And and
exactly.
also in a weird way, it would have been closure for this one for
Yeah.
Resurrection. Like we finally would have gotten that house story, and
Right.
uh,
Yeah. I did there's one funny thing in this one of the people who is in this movie is Katie Sackhoff, real
Yeah.
early in her career, which is funny because I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I love the Mandalorian. That's this season that's been going on. She's been a regular on it this season, so it's funny to see her, you know, weekly right now, and then see this movie of her, like with her, that was like 21 years ago, and see this much younger person. She was, I guess, 22 at the time it released, so 21, 22 when they filmed it. So, so it's funny too. Just it's bizarre. It's like if you're going back and seeing videos of me 21 years earlier would be bizarre too. So, but
Yeah, I didn't even
but
think
yeah,
about like because I don't watch The Mandalorian, so I had forgotten she was in anything recently. She was one of the first people though that I think out of like because I'm bad with actors' faces, so I watching like classic slashers, there are a lot of people, unless I know them from other slasher movies from that time, that'll just go
right.
like right over my head. But I knew Katie Sackhoff because of um uh oh God, because of Battlestar Galactica.
Battlestar Galactica.
I
Yeah.
almost forgot the name of it's been a while. But I recognize Katie Sackhoff and I recognize Paul Rudd. He looks exactly the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah.
In which was
Yeah.
wild to see because it's like, oh my God, that dude looks just like Paul Rudd. And then it's like, there's no way, right? But he looked like this long ago, and sure enough,
Oh yeah. No, yeah, that just goes into the whole Paul Rudd doesn't age thing. It's a
it really
vampire.
does.
He's an immortal. But yeah, no. Yeah, this one's funny too because yeah, it's you don't have very many of the people who are in this cast really who are as relevant anymore. Most of the people in this cast are just not, I mean, Busta Rhymes, I mean, Tyra Banks, I guess
Tyra
she's still
Banks.
somewhat she's still relevant in the reality circles. Um so it's but every other actor in this is just kind of like, medium to nothing at this point. And so it's nice to see Katie Sackhoff, who you know went from here to Battlestar Galactica, and had her star supremely elevated with that show, because it was a great show and she was great in it. And then to now be on The Mandalorian, which is a huge show in its own. It's like a cultural phenomenon. So it's just fun to go back and see something like that and go, oh, okay, early person. So
That is fun.
all right. Did you have anything else you wanted to specifically say about Resurrection?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah.
It's one of those
Unfortunately,
things
like we
I
didn't.
could complain about Resurrection all day,
Yeah.
but it's just because there are a lot of little like nitpicky problems with it
Yeah.
that are just messy, and it's hard to get because again, with other slasher movies, you can just get away with a lot of stuff where you're there for the kills or whatever, which I don't think the kills are that great in Resurrection. I think
No.
they set up a lot of cool ideas, but like as a slasher movie, we're expecting more creativity, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Halloween as a franchise just and you can't say always because this is, the eighth one. They've had some
Yeah.
slip ups at this point in the run, but it started off as a very immaculate, well-made movie.
Yeah.
And so it is hard to see stuff where it's just like there are these little like in there's so much stuff going on that's just like not cleaned up, and Tyra
Yeah.
Banks doesn't know how to make a cup of coffee and like they
Oh
have
my
but she's
God.
like doing it in the
So
background,
ridiculous. Yeah.
and it's like
Just dripping
there's
it
just like
everywhere.
stuff where you're like, and then and like you said, because there are enough sight gags in Resurrection where you don't know if like these things going on in the background are intentional or if the extras thought that no one was paying attention to them or like if they thought stuff was out of frame, like and you should know, like even
Yeah.
if these were all dumb intentional gags, they should come across as such. And I
Right.
the completion of this film is just very lazy and silly, and I could nitpick on it all day, but in terms of like it
Yeah.
didn't add a ton to the Halloween canon.
No, I'm gonna nitpick on one thing though too. Like, okay,
Yeah.
so they have these head-mounted cameras, and I get that for at the time that the quality was what it showed on
Yeah.
screen, that that's the quality of what we got. But here's my thing: as a movie, you don't have to make it that terrible quality. You could film it on good film or good digital or whatever we're doing, and just kind of, I don't know, make it
Give it an
slightly
effect.
worse. Yeah, put an effect on to make it slightly worse so that you could actually tell what the hell was going on, because so much of the movie is from their perspectives and those cameras, and so you're missing a whole bunch of stuff too. And so it's like it's worse than VHS quality a lot of times. And I'm just like, this is ridiculous, especially because I have the 4K discs and I'm watching this thing on 4K and it looks terrible. So
That's true. A lot of the kills might have been really creative because we didn't really get to see all of them.
yeah,
There are shots where you're just like, I don't know what's happening right now.
yeah, it's way too blurry and pixelated. I can't tell what the hell's going on. So
And movies
yeah,
like that on 4K, I think are almost worse, because when you're watching it
yeah,
like a lower resolution, it's like, okay, well, it's kind of grainy, but I kind of know what's going on. And then you get them to 4K, and it's like, anyway, here are the high grain edges of all these grains. And you're like, what?
yeah. Oh man,
What
it's
is
ridiculous.
happening?
I think it's funny too because so this movie is actually directed by Rick Rosenthal, who actually directed the original Halloween 2.
Which
So,
is so wild to me because
right?
I liked Halloween 2. Halloween 2 is a very, very strong
Very
installation.
strong. Yeah. Yeah. There are moments where I like it better than number one.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I will go out on that. I like John Carpenter. Don't get me wrong. I love John Carpenter. The first Halloween movie's kind of a little slow in the beginning for me and everything. I gain appreciation for it more and more every time I watch it. Um, but number two starts off, you know, big and continues on, for the most part. There's some slow bits here and there. But, so that's what drives me crazy is just that, like, he made number two. Like, he knows how to make a good Halloween movie. What the hell was this?
Yeah, and it's
So,
yeah, and that's with the directors sometimes you watch, like their best film and their worst film and you're like, it's wild that these two, but it his are in the same franchise. Like it's not just that he can make a
yeah.
good movie, he can make a good Halloween film and he has, and then he did this. It's like I'll never
And it's just,
understand this movie.
yeah. Well, and it's funny because both of these are interesting for the directors because this was Rick Rosenthal, and then the former one, like I mentioned, was Steve Miner, who actually did two entries in the Friday the 13th series. He did Friday the 13th Part 2 and Part 3. So
Both also very good installations
yeah,
of
definitely part of the 2 and 3 definitely at like because 2 is the first one we get with Jason, and 3 is the first one with the hockey mask. So it's like these great mythos making moments in both in that franchise. So yeah, so it's definitely, and like I said, H2O is not a bad movie. It's good, and
it's
that
not.
probably helped that Steve Miner was the director, and that him and Jamie Lee Curtis and Kevin Williamson all came together to attempt to make a post Scream version of Halloween that mostly works. So
Yeah. And it does. Again, I've gone on record just like picking on H2O and I don't really mean it because it uh Resurrection I mean to pick on. I mean
yeah,
every bad thing that I say about Resurrection like it's not the endearing kind of messy. It's just messy.
yeah. So H2O actually sits firmly right in the middle on my Halloween rankings. It's a good movie. But it's right there at number 7 of the 13 movies we've had so far. So
Oh wow. I think it's I don't have my list in front of me right now. I think it's a little bit lower than that, but it's near the center.
yeah,
I think it's like 6 or
yeah,
6, 8. I think it's like just below.
yeah. No,
But
it's a good movie. It's definitely good middle of the road in the franchise. So
yeah.
all right. Well, if we don't have anything else to talk about either of these movies, why don't you go ahead and let people know where they can find you online?
Oh, yeah, you can find me on Twitter at cat_Voleur, Voleur. You can check out my other podcast, Slasher Radio, and you can check out my website, catvoleur.com. It's got all my book information.
Yes. Yeah, make sure to go pre-order that book, Revenge Arc. Sounds like a fun read for sure.
I hope you like it. I hope I hope it goes well.
Yeah, yeah. As when that arc gets here, I will try to peruse it as much as possible. We had this conversation online already
Yeah,
about
it's
people who don't read right away, and you know what people's expectations are for that kind of stuff. So I like your attitude about it, because I'm
it's
definitely a
very
much
low
slower reader.
pressure.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I thank you again for coming on. It's
Yeah,
always great
thanks
to
for
have you
having
on
me.
here. All right, and we will see you next time. Thanks again to Kat for joining me. Next week, we conclude this look at the Halloween franchise with the Rob Zombie Halloween movies. Ariel Power Schaub returns to the show to discuss this reboot series. Thanks for listening. If you like what you've heard, please consider giving the show 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, please share the podcast on social media to help spread the word. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or at creepyandgeeky.com. Music for the podcast composed by Jerry Smith. You can follow the podcast on social media at Creepy and Geeky on both Twitter and Instagram. If you'd like to follow me, I'm Geek Thulu on Twitter and geek.thulu on Instagram. You can support the podcast by donating to the Ko-fi page. All of the links are in the show notes. Finally, don't forget, stay creepy.